Hey, family. Welcome back to the dinner table. I hope everybody's having a great week and y'all ready for Thanksgiving next week. And I sure hope y'all got y'all recipes put together because I will be making my rounds. But anyways, y'all, I'm not going to put too much on this week's intro. I do want to say this though. The way you parent and raise your children really does have an effect on the type of person or maybe even the type of monster they become in the future.
That's what it's all about. Guns and butter, baby.
All right, now, cousins, this week at the dinner table, I'm gonna be telling y'all about the youngest female murderer in the UK. Her name is Sharon Carr. You see, when she was only 12 years old, she killed an 18-year-old woman by the name of Katie Racklift. The detectives working the case would later describe this as a Jack the Ripper style of attack. It was just that gruesome. And they would have never imagined that the murder was committed by a 12-year-old schoolgirl. After taking a deeper dive into Sharon's background, maybe we can start to have a better understanding of what went wrong in her mind. What caused her behavior to switch so drastically? And how did she earn herself the nickname the Devil's Daughter? Sharon Louise Carr was born December 21st, 1979, in Belize. She never really knew her biological dad, so she was raised by her mom and her stepdad. Now, she was one of four children, but other than that, her siblings were not mentioned anywhere in the research. And growing up in Belize, she lived in extreme poverty. Her family was dirt poor. I mean, there were certain periods of time when they would have to go without water. And not only was she suffering due to her circumstances, but growing up with her parents, her mom was described as a very volatile and fiery character. But that's just to be nice. They said this woman had an explosive temper, like she was extremely cold and extremely heartless. So imagine having her as a mama. But her stepdaddy didn't make things any easier because he was an extremely angry and violent drunk. So on a daily between the two, her mom and her dad, she lived pretty much in the eye of the storm at all times. And either they were arguing and beating on one another or they was taking their anger out and beating on her and her siblings. And her mama wasn't just hitting and beating on her. She was also using extreme forms of disciplining and punishment. She would go as far as to burn her kids, even putting hot pepper on her kids' private parts. So after experiencing all this abuse and trauma at such a young age, her mom and her stepdad end up splitting, and she meets herself a new man. And he's an English soldier by the name of George Carr. Now, this man was a member of the Royal Army Medical Corps. Okay. And I'm sure she didn't know this man for long at all before she decided to marry him and move to England. And I'm not sure if her mom brought any of her other siblings, but she and Sharon moved to England with her new husband. And this was a huge culture shock for Sharon because she just came from being dirt poor, not having nothing, to all of a sudden having a house with floors and a roof over her head. And she actually lived in a really nice neighborhood in Chamberley, Surrey. She started going to a really nice school called Cornwallis Junior School. I think that's middle school. And she was described by her teachers as very polite, kind, even helpful. And I think this was the first time in her life when she was actually able to take a sigh of relief and just leave her life in Belize behind. I mean, she joined the basketball team and she even managed to make herself a nice little group of friends. And she was described by her friends as being very social. And that was probably all she needed. Make some friends, be around people of your same age, and to just be a child. But although she was thriving in school, her home life hadn't changed much from Belize. She was still witnessing domestic violence on a daily. Her mom and new stepdad were constantly arguing, constantly fighting, and it was just nonstop turbulence. And after witnessing this much violence and this much abuse from such a young age, up close and personal at that, she grew some sort of tolerance to it, like she just became immune to it. It was almost as if the arguing and the fighting just became white noise in her background. And she and her mom hadn't been in England long at all before George decided, look, this is too much for me. You are too much drama, like you came with too much. You was a sweet, nice lady back in Belize, but you done turned into a whole nother person. So when he goes over to the house to break up with her, she opens the door and she said, Oh, you want to leave me, huh? So she says, Why don't you come on in so we could talk about this a little bit more? And once he gets inside, she marches into the kitchen and grabs a boiling pot of hot grease and dumps it on him. And while he's running through the house, screaming, literally melting away, Sharon is standing in the doorway just watching him. She wasn't scared. She didn't have any emotion on her face. She was just standing there watching with no reaction. She didn't even flinch. He was rushed to the hospital with serious burns and injuries, and her mom was later arrested and charged with assault. And for this, she was handed down a suspended sentence, which meant that she didn't have to serve any time for it. Instead, she was ordered to receive mental health therapy for 3 years. But do y'all actually think this woman went and received any treatment? Come on now. Okay, so at some point, her mom eventually introduced her to practicing voodooism. Like, what in the Alton Coleman is going on here? She would participate in animal sacrifices, like killing live animals. And she was also taught how to recite rituals and how to put spells on people so that you can have complete control over them or even harm them. What? Is that real? Like, is voodoo actually real? Y'all let me know. But it's believed at this time when she started actually killing things is when she became fixated on death and killing. And this happened really quickly. It was like once she got that first taste of blood and she got that first kill, she just couldn't stop. And it got so bad because it wasn't like she was killing stray cats or rodents. She was killing her neighbor's pets. And she wasn't slick about it either because they all knew she was the one making their pets disappear. And she even took pride in admitting that she had decapitated a dog using a spade. And I think that's just another word for a shovel. But by this time, she started to develop a pretty bad reputation, as you could imagine. Now, we don't know what happened or what caused this switch in her, but she turned into a completely different person. And like most kids do when they start to change, she started hanging around a completely different group of kids, which consisted of mostly boys that were a lot older than her. Her little young ass was stealing. She started carrying around a knife as if she really had like real enemies to use it on. And then she started smoking weed and selling drugs. All of this at the tender age of 11. And along with all these big lifestyle changes, she started to become really aggressive in school, always looking for attention and just being that problematic kid that stayed in trouble and stayed having a problem with authority. A therapist later hypothesized that this move to England, although it may have been a better living situation for her, it created a lot of resentment within her. You see, this therapist thought that because she came from essentially nothing and now she's around people who have everything, she struggled with this. And these major behavioral changes didn't go unnoticed because the head teacher at Collingwood College Comprehensive School went ahead and made a report to social services. So in 1990, after the report was made, Sharon was removed from her home. But that didn't last long because a month later she was allowed to be returned home. Her mom eventually went on to find herself another man. She moved him into the house, and I'm sure this started another cycle of tension, arguing, domestic violence, the whole nine. But at this point in Sharon's life, this was her normal. In the early morning hours of June 7th, 1992, Sharon, who's now 12 at the time, was out and about cruising the streets, riding around in a car with two older guys. It's not said how much older they were, but they were old enough to be driving. Maybe. But while they're out riding around up to no good, the three of them spot 18-year-old Katie Racklift walking alone. 18-year-old Katie Racklift was born in 1974 to her parents Helen and Joseph Rackliff, and she grew up in Honley, Surrey, South England. She also had one older sister named Joanne, and she came from a very nice, loving, close-knit family. And opposed to Sharon, she had a pretty happy and regular upbringing. Katie was one of those girls who had her entire life planned out. She knew what she knew what she wanted to be, and she was going to work hard to get there. So at the time, she was working her way up the chain, taking it one step at a time. So she was working as an apprentice hairdresser with the hopes of eventually owning her own salon one day. But over at the salon, she was well liked, and she just thrived in that type of environment. She was a social butterfly. Like, she was a great conversationalist. And overall, like I said, she was just well liked by the clients. So every day she was building up her confidence, getting more clients, and becoming more popular. So for just a split second in her life, nothing good ever lasts long. But everything was looking up for her. She was excited about where she was going in life. She was happy. Everything was smooth. But Katie's brief moments of bliss all came to an end in May of 1992. And this is when her boyfriend, 24-year-old Metlin Mustafa, just dumps her. This was her first real love, her first everything. So she was completely crushed by this. I mean, she had already started to plan the rest of her life with this man. Like, how could he do this to her? And just like with every first heartbreak, she became very depressed. I mean, she was toe up about this man kicking her to the curb. And other than going to work, she rarely left the house. And everybody at the salon noticed her mood change. Like, they could tell she was going through it mentally. But after a few weeks of moping around and feeling sorry for herself, her friends are like, enough is enough. So on June 6, 1992, after much peer pressure, her friends managed to convince her to come out with them. Just let your hair down, get some fresh air. Let's have a girls' night, get this man off your mind. Let's have a good time. So she agrees. She's like, okay, I'll go. And she gets cute that night. She wears a little white crop top, some navy trousers, ankle boots, and a little blue jacket. So the girls head to a club in Cambridge called Ragamuffins, and this is where they start their night. They singing, dancing, getting drunk, having a time. And just when her ex is starting to fade to the back of her mind, out of the corner of her eye, she spots him. And at this time, she's full of liquid courage. So she walks right up to him and does the unexpected. She starts begging and pleading him to take her back. She's professing her love, telling him how much she misses him, how much she wants him back. And he like, girl, excuse me. In plain English, he tells her, I don't want you no more. I've moved on. I found another woman. And this just sends Katie over the edge. I mean, she was already tore up with the breakup itself. But now that she's professing her love to him and he still doesn't want her back. So with one last humiliating attempt to get this man back, she asks him if he can take her home. But he coldly responds, no. So she immediately turns around and runs out the club. So she's now even more heartbroken, devastated, and now humiliated. So she starts walking home. And that's when Sharon and her group of friends pulls up alongside of her and asks her if she wants a ride home. So now that we know the mental state Katie was in as she left the club, I mean, she had just been dumped in front of everyone by someone she was literally planning to spend the rest of her life with only a couple weeks before this. So my girl is more than heartbroken, and there was no way she was going to show her face back in that club again. So she starts walking home alone. And this is when Sharon and her little crew pull up alongside of her and offer her a ride. And after the experience she just had in the nightclub, this ride seemed like the quickest and the best way to get home. Now, why she decided to get in the car with these three randoms, we don't know. But people have theorized that seeing sweet little 12-year-old Sharon sitting in the back seat probably made her decision to get in the car a little bit easier. So Katie agrees, she hops in the car, and the person driving is just cruising the streets, taking his time, going nowhere in particular. And that's when Katie realizes that he's driving in the complete opposite direction of her home. He was going towards Farnborough. He eventually drives to a dark, desolate, and isolated area. And I'm sure at this time Katie sobered up real quick. And her fight or flight kicked in immediately. She like, I'm not about to stick around and figure out what y'all are about to do to me. So she opens the door and bolts out of the car. And as she's running away as fast as she can, her fast wasn't fast enough because young ass Sharon was hawking her down. And some way, somehow, she caught up to her. And as soon as she catches up to her, she wastes no time. She pounces on Katie and starts stabbing her from behind with a 6.5-inch knife. After Katie drops to the ground, Sharon is out of control. She's stabbing and slashing and slicing right through Katie's flesh. And she continues stabbing, even after Katie had already died. At this point, she was soaking it in. She was enjoying every moment of what she was doing. So with this, she proceeds to prolong the attack by mutilating Katie, slashing her face, her breast, and her vagina. When it was all said and done, Katie suffered 32 stab wounds, puncturing vital organs like her liver, stomach, lungs, heart, and genitalia. Katie was now half naked and soaked in her blood. Her body was then dragged and slumped up against the wall of a cemetery and just left there. Katie's mutilated body was discovered a couple of hours later by a group of 4 boys who was out for an early morning walk following a night of camping. The police were immediately notified, and eventually the body was identified as 18-year-old Katie Racklift, and a murder investigation quickly ensued. And her ex-boyfriend Matlin was the first person they wanted to talk to. But to their surprise, when he found out what happened to Katie, he completely broke down. And I hope he felt like shit, because if he had just been a little bit nicer and just taken her home like she had asked, maybe she would still be alive today. But that's neither here nor there. So after her body was discovered, the police do a press conference asking for anyone who was in or around the Ragamuffins nightclub on the evening the murder took place to come forward if they had any information. I mean, maybe somebody saw her leave with somebody, maybe if they saw somebody following her, anything. They just needed a starting point for this investigation. But where her body was found really started to draw a lot of questions for investigators, because she was found in Farnborough, which, like I said, was the opposite direction of where she lived. And she didn't have any friends or any particular reason to be out that way. So the question they needed to answer was, how did she get out this way? So based off of how gruesome the crime was, investigators do their best to start creating a criminal profile on their killer. So they figure the killer is most likely a man in his early to mid-30s who has a strong muscular build. And the reason why they believed it was this big, strong man was strictly because of how violent the crime and Katie's wounds were. I mean, she was clearly overpowered by somebody bigger than her, right? And they figured whoever committed the crime enjoyed what they were doing. But her wounds were a mix of stabs and slashes. Some were deep, some were superficial. And because her breast and vagina were mutilated as well, they figured that this was most likely sexually motivated. So after they put together a criminal profile, they also come up with like a fake composite sketch of what they think the man could look like. But unfortunately, despite all of their efforts and following every tip and every lead, they were still no closer to solving Katie's murder. And for the next 2 years, Katie's case would go unsolved. But the next 2 years for Sharon, well, she would go on to write in her diary, relishing in what she had done to Katie, detailing the whole murder and the arousal she got from it. She would write things like, I bring the knife into her chest. Her eyes were closing. She is pleasing me, so I bring the knife to her again and again. I don't want to hurt her, but I need to do violence to her. I need to overcome her beauty, her serenity, her security. There, I see her face when she died. I know she feels her life being slowly drawn away from her, and I hear her gasp. I guess she was trying to breathe. If only I could kill you again. I promise I would. You suffer more this time, you fucking slag. Your terrified screams turn me on, more and more. I mean, she wanted to remember and relive every single detail of this night. And she was also aware that the police were looking for Katie's killer, but she knew she wasn't even close to being on their radar. And this gave her even more gratification. But writing everything in her journal, she was trying to get this rush. She was trying to get back to this feeling that she had when she was committing the murder. But writing it was never going to get her any closer to that high. So on the second anniversary of Katie's murder, literally 2 years and a day to the date, so on June 7th, 1994, Sharon wrote in her diary about her desire to murder again. But this murder would be a little bit different. You see, this murder would be even more brutal and last much longer, so she can really sit and enjoy the painful screams that she inflicts on somebody. But this diary entry wasn't just a fantasy for her. It was a plan, and she had full intentions to carry it out. So on the second year anniversary, she approaches 13-year-old Annie Marie Clifford, and she lures her in the bathroom by telling her that she lost a pound or a coin in the toilet and she needed help finding it. Now, Sharon was somewhat of a bully in school, so when she approached Annie Marie, she was too scared to tell her no, and she felt like she had no other choice but to follow Sharon into the bathroom and help her out. But as soon as they get into the bathroom, Sharon pushes Annie Marie to the ground. And as she's towering over her, she reaches into her bag and pulls out a 4-inch knife. Annie Marie recalls Sharon laughing and tossing the knife between her hands and just bursting with excitement. And she's sitting there scared for her life. But she wasn't going to go down easily. So she jumps up from the floor and tries to make a run for the door. But Sharon knocked her to the ground again, raised her arm, and stabs Annie Marie in the back. But at that exact moment, a group of 5 other girls come into the bathroom, saving Annie Marie from what was about to be her last day on this earth. But that single stab wound punctured her lung, and blood was gushing out of her rapidly. Luckily, she was quickly rushed to the hospital, and thankfully, she survived the attack. Back at the school, Sharon was immediately arrested and taken in for a psych eval. But she was still high off adrenaline from the attack, and she wanted to keep the party going. She assaulted 2 members of the staff at the facility where she was being held by strangling them, and she was quickly deemed too dangerous to be there, so she was transferred to a young offenders institute. In December of 1994, just 6 months after the attack, Sharon was convicted of 2 counts of causing bodily harm. And in some parts of the research, it says that she was sentenced to 2 years for this. And then in another one of my sources, I read that she was sentenced to Her Majesty's pleasure, which basically meant that there was no minimum time limit on how long you had to serve. So basically, you would just be there until you weren't there. But in Sharon's case, she would be kept there until it was decided whether or not it was safe to release her back to society. And well, I guess that time never came for Sharon. For months, Sharon would go on to be bounced between different psych units, never staying in one unit for too long, because she was always up to her old ways, messing with folks and instigating fights for no good reason at all. So that following year in September of 1995, she was transferred to Bullwood Hall Young Offenders Unit, where they seemed to be able to manage her a little bit better. And while at Bullwood, the staff noticed that she was a little chatty Cathy when it came to talking about herself. And she was doing a lot of talking, especially when it came to this old murder case. She would be on the phone talking about it, and if you wanted to hear anything she had to say, she was going to mention it. I mean, not directly talking about it, just glazing over it, just lightly touching on it. And she started developing a little crush on one of the male prison guards. And while she trying to be cute and flirt, spit her little game at him, she would start telling him about this murder. And it started to get to a point where she was speaking about it so often that the staff really started to get concerned. So they went ahead and reported these concerns to police. And it was at this time when they started to piece together small details of what Sharon was saying to the details of Katie's murder. And now, at almost 4 years later, the officers wanted to sit down and have a conversation with Sharon. But before they did that, they conducted a full search of her room. And with that, they seized her diary. And in her diary, they found all of her deep, twisted thoughts. They were able to read all the gruesome details of what she did to Katie that night, and all the thoughts that were going through her mind. And not only that, but the sexual excitement she got from it as well. This little girl even drew a picture of the knife she used to stab Katie. And she would go on to refer to herself as the devil, saying, quote, "Overnight, I see the devil in my dreams, sometimes even in the mirror, but I realize it's just me." She would go on to say, "I was born to be a murderer. Killing is for me, a mass turn on, and it just makes me so high that I never want to come down. I swear I was born to be a murderer. I'm a killer. Killing is my business, and business is good." She went on to talk about Katie's final moments, saying, "The air stopped in the back of her throat. I know all her life her breathing has worked, but now it does not, and I am joyful." And every year on the anniversary of Katie's murder, Sharon would dedicate an entry to Katie. On the second anniversary, she wrote about her desire to kill again, and then she attempted to kill Anne Marie. But on the third anniversary, she wrote, quote, "Killed KR. The death by knife wounds and sex go together." On the fourth anniversary year, she wrote, quote, "Respect to Katie Racklift, 4 years ago today." Now, although all of these diary entries were very detailed, the investigators still had a lot of questions. They still had to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Sharon was the one that committed the murder. I mean, because quite frankly, after all these years, they had been looking for a man in his 30s, muscular, strong, when in fact, it was a little old 12-year-old schoolgirl. They never put two and two together that a crime this gruesome could be committed by a child. So when they finally sat down to question her about the murder, she fully confessed, and she didn't hold back anything. And over the course of a couple days, she was questioned for a total of 27 hours. And she went on to speak openly about the murder she committed, with excitement at that. It was like she had been holding it in for so long. Finally, after all these years, she was getting to share in great detail what had happened. I mean, at this point, she didn't have anything to lose. So she went ahead and just relived in the moment. So in her confession, she spoke about details that were withheld from the public. And these were things that only the killer would know. She went on to talk about the bracelet she stole off of Katie's wrist, which wasn't a detail that was released to the public. And this further solidified her confession. But the entire time, she showed absolutely no remorse, even laughing while recalling certain moments. But some of the details that I mentioned earlier were kind of mixed up in her version of events. For instance, in one version of her account, she told them that she alone dragged Katie's body from the crime scene to the cemetery wall. But officers found this a little unbelievable because a dead body would kind of be a little bit too heavy for a 12-year-old girl alone to drag. But I mean, after what she's done, who's to say she didn't? But she would also contradict herself by saying that she did it alone. Then she would say the two boys who she was with helped her move Katie's body. And she did eventually give up the two boys' names. But when they were tracked down and questioned, they apparently had alibis and had nothing to do with whatever this girl is talking about. I don't even know her. I don't even know a Sharon. And I know that's right. Look, if somebody comes to you talking about a murder, say nothing, okay? And that's exactly what they did. But in another version of her account, she states that the attack happened in the car, and that's what caused Katie to run away. But because these small details weren't necessarily able to be fully confirmed, we'll never actually have all of the details all the way through of what happened to Katie. But one thing that was consistent all the way through is that Sharon is the one who committed the murder. Alone. And she was proud of that. Sharon would go on to be diagnosed with schizoaffective behavior, which is kind of on the spectrum of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. So the schizo symptoms is psychosis, meaning that those are the hallucinations or the delusions, and the affective part of the schizoaffective refers to the mood symptoms. And this could lead to episodes of deep depression or episodes of mania. Now, in May of 1996, Sharon was officially charged with the murder of Katie Racklift. Her trial was held at the Winchester Crown Court in February of 1997, where she entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. And after a month-long trial, the jury finally deliberated. And after 5 short hours, they reached a verdict. So on March 25th, 1997, Sharon Carr's little bad, unhinged ass was found guilty of murdering Katie Racklift. Now, this guilty verdict gave Sharon the title of Britain's youngest female murderer. I mean, she had really carried out a full-fledged gruesome murder at the age of 12. Although her record was almost beat by a 10-year-old girl named Mary Bell. You see, Mary Bell killed 2 children from Newcastle, and her first victim she killed when she was only 10 years old. However, she had only been convicted of manslaughter and not murder, and that's why Sharon was able to claim the title of being the youngest female killer in the UK. And that was just another one of her lifelong accomplishments that she was oh so proud of. Now, at the end of Sharon's trial, the judge gives his final remarks. And he says to Sharon, quote, "What's clear is that you had a sexual motive for this killing. And it's apparent both from the brutal manner in which you mutilated her body and by the chilling entries in your diary. That killing, as you put it, turns you on. You are, in my view, an extremely dangerous woman." And with that, Sharon was sentenced to life in prison with 14 years to serve. But as her sentence was being handed down, and even as she walked out of the courtroom, she was beaming from ear to ear like the judge had just told her she was about to be released immediately. Now, her team has since filed several appeals against this murder conviction. However, they were all denied. So Sharon began her sentence at the HMP Holloway. I don't know what that is, but she was eventually transferred to the infamous Bordermere Hospital in 1998. But even here, her violent and aggressive behavior was just nonstop. She stayed in fights with the other patients, even assaulting staff members. But y'all, in June of 2001, of course within the walls of Bordomir, Sharon, now 21, she meets 24-year-old Robbie Lane. They fall in love, they get engaged, and they go on to set a date for their little wedding. Look, there's somebody for everybody, okay? So they were allowed supervised visits in each other's room every month, and they even saved up enough money to buy wedding rings. So get this. In the days leading up to their wedding, a newspaper wrote about their plans to get married, right? Now this article details both Robbie and Sharon's crimes. It talks about how Robbie murdered his own mom by beating, stabbing, and then gouging out her eyes. And he did all of this because he was in a rage of jealousy, thinking that his mom favored his sister over him. But after reading the article and learning what one another had done, they pretty much just grew disgusted with one another. They were, quote, shocked, horrified, and disgusted by the ferocity of each other's murders. Very interesting, right? So with that, they immediately called off the wedding and never spoke again. But in 2015, Sharon, now 36, was transferred to the HMP Bronzefield as a restricted status prisoner. This meant that she was being held in a closed prison, and she spent majority of her time in solitary. And after not being there long at all, she was then transferred again to the HMP La Newton. But she didn't last there long at all either. And at 36, she still ain't learned because she's still in there acting up. So while at the HMP La Newton, she attacked one of her cellmates. So she was moved back to the HMP Bronzefield in 2020. Now, she did apply for her restricted status to be downgraded. However, she was still considered a very high-risk and dangerous prisoner. So, of course, her request was denied. So, the judge that denied her request says that the reason he denied it was because she disclosed thoughts of wanting to murder another resident by slitting her head open with the flask and throwing her down the stairs to snap her neck. Last year in August, Sharon, being 44 at the time, was up for parole. But your girl was denied. Now, last year in 2023 was her 30th year of being locked up. And I wonder if they'll ever decide if she'll ever be fit to go back out into society, or if they're just going to keep her caged up, drugged up, and she's just never going to change. She's going to stay violent, she's going to stay mean, she's going to stay rebellious, and that's just who she is. And I low-key want to know where her mom is and what she has to say about the way her daughter turned out. Because like I said in the beginning, how you raise your kids really does have an effect on the type of person they become. But y'all, that's the end of this week's case. I hope y'all enjoyed this case. Make sure you're following me on whatever platform you're listening on, Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio, whatever it is. Make sure you're following me so that you can get alerted whenever I drop a new episode. And as usual, I'll see y'all same place, same time next week.